Welcome to the Prime Venture Partners podcast. This is Amit Somani, your host. I am delighted to have with us a dear friend and a former entrepreneur and now a tech evangelist with the government, Amit Ranjan, to the show. Welcome, Amit.
Thanks, Amit, for having me. I think it's a great pleasure to be part of this show. And my history with you, friendship with you, goes back many years. I think we've done multiple programs and initiatives over the last decade, and now doing this podcast. So great to be on this show.
Absolutely, and we should maybe start with that a little bit, even though that's a little bit off the script here. Amit and I used to do a lot of these roundtables and other things for iSpirit and earlier than that NASSCOM and NASSCOM Product Council and so forth. So how is the tech scene in Delhi? In terms of where it was, say, when you and I would hang out, say 10, 12 years ago, have things improved dramatically in terms of, the tech talent and the product talent and so forth compared to, say, 10 years ago?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. No questions about it. In fact, when I meet teams now in 2021, and I compare it to what we were like, 15 or 16 years ago, honestly, I get an acute sense of inferiority complex. I find people are just so smart and they are so quick to pick up. Back then, one of the key differences that that seems to come to me is that, back then people were still trying to figure out the answers. So a lot of time and effort just went into, okay, which path to choose, what to do. And while that was very rewarding in many ways, but it was also a little bit wasteful in the sense. Now, I think the ecosystem is kind of, gotten to a stage where a lot of these paths are out there. They are clearly understood. And, you really don't have to spend a lot of time trying to kind of figure out, okay, which paths to choose. Right? You can go on the internet and listen to podcasts and read up blogs, and you know to a large extent how to kind of, which playbook should I adopt. So you can actually get into the execution mode much faster. And I think that is probably contributing to this feeling that I get, is that why are entrepreneurs so much more smarter today than they were 15 years ago? And even, in something like products, you look at product capabilities, design capabilities in a place like India. You're asking about Delhi. Well, I haven't been to a lot of these events lately, simply because of my involvement with the government. So I was slightly, I would say, out of the circuit. But in general, you do get to see very high proficiency, much higher levels of execution. This is a deluge. This is a great time to be an entrepreneur and to be working in technology companies. And whether you are from product, or you are from technology, or you're from design, or you're from sales and marketing, there's just so much energy happening all around you that it's a great time to be a part of this movement.
Wonderful. So you were, of course, most famous as one of the co-founders of SlideShare, and I'm still a very happy customer, even post the LinkedIn acquisition, which seems like many years ago now. Just a very quick brief, and I know you've talked a lot about it. Maybe any of the lessons learned from that, including the exit process, and if you were to reflect back, that you would want to share with some of the newer age entrepreneurs in terms of what's happening now.
Right. Yeah. So, honestly, SlideShare seems like so many years ago. It's been almost 9 years since the exit was made. So I would say that two learnings that kind of, spring to mind when I look back, at that journey and that era. So obviously we started in a very different era. This was 2005. And, one of the things that you realize is that this whole thing about doing startups, it's kind of a mix of the art and the science. Right. And you got to kind of, really get on top of how to kind of, arrive at this optimum mix of where is the art and where is the science. And I think the best way this was kind of explained by Peter Thiel when he said that, startups are a 0 to 1 and a 1 to 5 and a 5 to 10 and a 10 to 50 and a 50 to 100 journey. And what you realize is that at different parts of that journey, you need to think and act and behave very differently. The range of solutions that you have in the 0 to 1 phase which kind of tends towards the art part. It tends to be very different from what you would do in the 10 to 50 and the 50 to 100. The whole gamut of solutions, approaches, the way you would go about building the company just kind of undergoes a complete somersault. So that was one of the learnings. And while we got acquired, I would say pretty much still in the early stages. But that was a learning that kind of stays with me, and I've kind of felt that even with my government stint and thereafter. And the other thing that is worth kind of pointing out is that, and I think it's talked about fairly often, is that you realize the role and the value of building the right technology culture, right? I mean, we've all heard the saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast, but you see that metaphor playing out in the life cycle of a startup in so many different ways. Is that finally it boils down to the people you have, the kind of, and I always say this, that to me the 50% of the role of a founder in any startup is just the people function. And when I say the people function, I mean the whole set of activities where you need to, first of all, be a magnet for the best people in industry, attract them towards your startup, be able to hire them, induct them, train them, get them to perform at a very high level, plan their career progression, make sure that they feel rewarded. And if you can actually do a good job with this people function, that's 50% of your job, 50% of the job of any founder. And that's also one of the reasons why I feel that startups with multiple founders tend to have a little bit of an advantage, simply because if you're a sole founder and so much of your time is just getting into just managing people, you might just have less time left for some of the other things. So in a nutshell, that's the two things that kind of comes to mind when I look back at the SlideShare journey. And I would say that we've been fortunate to have played a small role in building something that was a part of the whole, the social part of the evolution of the internet. And the consumer internet is very competitive. It's like the often I feel that it's like the crown jewel in the entire internet space. It's very competitive. It's very hard to kind of make impact there. And we were fortunate to some extent with what we did at SlideShare.
No, absolutely. And I think you guys definitely contribute a lot. I think I'm a big fan of SlideShare, not just for the product, but what I've heard from you on the distribution, on how you could get to like 100 million monthly actives with no marketing, or rather doing it all organically through content and so forth. But maybe we'll leave that for another day, because you've been doing amazing things since then. So let's switch gears and talk about some of the work that you're doing under the overall umbrella of Digital India, and in particular India Stack. I mean, that has taken the world by storm, and it's actually also unleashed a lot of these new age kind of innovations, right? Whether it be UPI or it be Aadhaar, eKYC, and some of the newer initiatives, not newer, but some of the initiatives that you've been more deeply involved with, such as DigiLocker and more recently OpenFort. So can you just talk to us overall about the whole India Stack and what it is to be kind of innovating from inside the government for public good, but yet in a partnership model, in an open source partnership model with the private sector and so forth. Love to hear about that. And then we can dive into some of the areas that you're directly kind of driving, so to speak.
Right. So I would say that, we were very fortunate, and I was personally very fortunate that, just when I was exiting SlideShare and LinkedIn and trying to figure out what to do next, that was the juncture at which this opportunity came about. And I would actually go back maybe half a decade earlier to that. So if you look at what happened with the Aadhaar ecosystem way back in 2008 or 2009, where the government of the day kind of figured out that you need digital identity at the foundation to be able to build a whole set of public goods, e-governance products, services on top of it. So by 2015, Aadhaar was kind of pretty much on the march. The government had about 60-70 crore Aadhaar numbers given out. And that was the juncture where I think the feeling within the government was that, okay, now that you have the digital identity capabilities of Aadhaar, you have them at your disposal, then now what are the other goods and services that you can build on top of it, right? And the other thing that was happening was this, and there's a lot of intrigue in the government when they looked actually at what had happened in the larger internet. They looked at the likes of what had happened in Silicon Valley, looked at Google, Yahoo, Facebook, and the thinking was that if these companies can build such large platforms in so short a time without spending tons of money, then why is it that you cannot borrow some of that goodness and maybe get it inside what governments are doing? Right. And so the realization was that the governments need to actually understand this whole paradigm of openness that kind of drives the internet. And when I say openness, so think open APIs, think open source, right? Think open data. I mean, what is all this thing about? So I was fortunate enough to kind of, enter the government at that juncture where they were thinking about, what do you do next with the digital identity capabilities of Aadhaar? And B, the larger, backdrop was where they had started waking up to this whole, whole business of open APIs and open source and open data kind of a thing there. So I would say that, my involvement largely has been around 2 or 3 different initiatives. So one was the DigiLocker, which, as you mentioned, and DigiLocker is, it's a digitization platform for citizen-centric data. So imagine all these, documents and certificates that are issued to Indian citizens over their lifetime. And all of this happens in paper. So if you were to digitize and build a complete ecosystem for that, that's DigiLocker for you. So we started in 2015, and now it's been about 5 or 6 years, and the platform is now up and running. It's kind of picked up really well. And on the other hand, the other project that we kind of got started with was something called OpenForge. And OpenForge was, I think most of us are aware of what GitHub has done.
Right.
Right. And many of the startups, many people in technology use GitHub's different services. So OpenForge is think GitHub, but like private platform for the government. So the thinking was that if you really want to build high quality products and services, what are the tools, what are the systems, what are the processes that you would need inside the government to be able to do that? And one of the feelings was that, we need to have things like open API platforms, open source platforms, and introduce some of these good, next generation development practices. DevOps was coming up in a big way. Cloud computing was coming up in a big way. So the idea was that how do you kind of introduce government's internal teams to some of these latest and the newest trends. So we built OpenForge there, and it's been kind of I would say an interesting journey. Now is a time when the platform has really started picking up, because it's taken us a little bit of a while. One of the challenges that I've personally had with OpenForge is that for something like DigiLocker is very easy to explain to anyone, right? And whether it's a bureaucrat or it's the minister or anybody else, you don't need to really explain. They understand what this is. But it's very hard to explain something like what is OpenForge, what is open source, what are open APIs, to people like bureaucrats and ministers who obviously are busy in their own world, and they may not necessarily have a particular understanding of this. So to be able to explain it to them, to really dumb it down to the level of a least common denominator and explain to them that, look here, this is what this platform is. I think we've definitely, I personally have had a little bit of a struggle, and we've had very important learnings. But now I think, we have kind of entered a different stage where there's also understanding about, things like privacy, consent. India is on the verge of kind of rolling out its data protection law. So I think now by 2021, there is a much higher level of understanding and heightened awareness about, about open source or open APIs and open data and things like that. So And we are seeing that with open forges, that now really lots and lots of government departments are taking to it, and their own development practices are kind of just going from the jumping orbits completely. If they were like here right now they have kind of jumped up to two levels completely. So and so that has been the kind of projects that I have been involved with during my government stint.
Amit, lots of follow-up questions, but let me just start with this, both your opening comment and the last one, which is cultivating an open mindset in fundamentally an organization like the government, which is inherently, I don't want to say close-minded, but they're sort of very focused, right? And they're sort of more inward focused, and that's where all the notion of sort of bureaucracy and all that kind of comes in. So how did that even happen overall, right? Or is it that the success of the things like Aadhaar and UPI and so on led the government to have like a more open mindset, and therefore it's like a little bit of a virtuous cycle to encourage these other initiatives like OpenForge and so forth?
I would say it's a combination of things, Amit. To me, when somebody like Nandan Nilekani, who was the head of the Aadhaar project, he came in, and the Aadhaar team was kind of adopted an open architecture, whereby the government was helping build this platform, but the whole idea was that both the public and the private sectors can actually plug into the platform. So it was kind of a radical shift from the way government thinks about whatever they are trying to build. It's a fundamental shift in the way government thinks about it. But the reason why I think it resonated with the government also was because the government was influenced by what they were seeing in the larger internet. And I was going back to my earlier point, is that they were looking at, I remember when I went to, when I joined the government, and, this whole thing about, how much money do you spend on IT platforms and, technologies. And when you realize that, all these companies like the Googles and the Yahoos of the world, they've actually spent zero money, and it's all open source technologies. Whereas if you go into the government, typically they'd be spending crores and crores of rupees in their IT budgets going after proprietary software. So at some point in time, that question kind of kicks in, even within the government, that okay, how is it that we are spending these enormous sums of money, and this is and yet the end product that we are able to build is not really that great. But you look at all these companies which seem to have sprung out of university campuses, two people in a garage, and they just obviously you don't have the kind of resources that a sovereign government would have. So at some point in time they start kind of questioning that what is happening here, what is it, this big wave that we are missing. And I think that's where they would have kind of figured out that okay, we really need to understand this whole thing about this open paradigm, whether it is open source or whether it is open APIs. And I think they were kind of, when they would have looked at something like an Aadhaar, which was coming about in the same way. So what Nandan Nilekani would have done is that he would have actually resonated the same thing, that yes, there is immense value in building something on an open architecture, which kind of, allows these network effects to kick in. So every new addition to the network kind of makes the network more valuable to anybody else who comes in later. So I would say it's a combination of, these multiple phenomena that's kind of made the government realize the value of openness.
Got it. So let's go back to DigiLocker for a moment. And can you talk to us about some of the use cases where it has already been deployed successfully, both from a government point of view and there are private instances of DigiLockers and that API and that instantiation, right? So maybe some of the more commercially successful ones that you are aware of, that people have leveraged the kind of DigiLocker framework, right, and so forth.
Sure. So I'd say that some of the popular use cases revolve around digital identity. So if you are, like, for example, if you are going on an aeroplane and you go to the airport, or you are traveling by train and you go to the railway station, then now you can actually take out your mobile phone and flash your DigiLocker identity, and it is accepted by the authorities. And it takes a lot to actually get that moving, by the way. I mean, building the technology part is just, I think it is the easiest part, honestly.
Absolutely. I have personally used it and been scared that the first time I was using it, saying, what if they say, no, this is not proof of identity, and it works just fine.
Yeah, and I can double click on that, why it is so different, why it is so difficult. So let's take the case of, for example, these driving licenses and these vehicle registrations. So that is one of our most viral use cases. So, across the country, now you can actually, pretty much across the country, I think, except for maybe a few states, you can actually carry digital versions of the driving license and the vehicle registration. And if a cop stops you on the road and says, okay, show me these documents, you can actually flash your DigiLocker digitized versions. Now, but if you take a step back and say, what would it take to kind of, make that happen? So I would say that, the technology piece of making that happen was actually it didn't take us more than about a year and a half. I mean, we started with this. This was one of the first use cases that we started off with, and in 2015, and by the middle of 2016, this was up and running. But to make sure that, if the cop on the road somewhere in a distant state in India, if he were to stop you and he kind of honors your flashing the digital version of the documents in front of you, that takes a lot of effort. And why? Because, for example, something like in transport is it comes under the concurrent list, right? So you have the central list, and you have the state list, and you have the concurrent list. So there are many of these departments which come under the concurrent, which means that it is both under the center and it is both under the state. So both state and centers have jurisdiction of these, right? So what it meant was that after we made the use case, we actually went to the Central Transport Ministry, the Ministry of Transport, and they actually first notified that, okay, DigiLocker documents are valid and they are considered at par, and they can be used for showing of these documents and all. But just the central notification is not enough. What you got to do now is to go to each of the 35 states and union territories in India and get each of them to actually notify individually about that, DigiLocker is valid in my state, it is valid in Andhra Pradesh, it is valid in Uttar Pradesh, it is valid in the Northeast, it is valid in Tamil Nadu. So you can imagine that it kind of, just to make sure that the technology actually gets adopted and used at the grassroots level. Now it kind of, becomes like a mammoth task for our team, for the DigiLocker team, to go around the entire country, talk to all these 35 government departments and get them to actually notify and issue. And because they have to go back and amend the state laws, right? They will notify only if it actually is a part of their legal statutes and they are part of the law. So, and that is what happened, is that, we built this technology in a year and a half. The next 6 to 12 months, the Central Transport Ministry notified that, but it took us the next 3 years to get all these states to kind of, notify about DigiLocker usage across the length and breadth of the country. So that has been a key learning for us. But yeah, so those are, very popular use cases: driving license, passport, showing on, as I said, airports and railways. I think on the commercial side, I would say that we probably have not been as successful as I would have imagined or hoped. But there are, notable use cases which are kind of, which are picked up big time. So, for example, one use case that comes to mind is this online share trading platforms. So think of the likes of Zerodha, ICICI Direct, Upstocks. So that entire mini industry. So they have actually taken to DigiLocker in a big way, because they have to sign up users as part of their online workflows, and DigiLocker is a part of the online KYC that they are doing. So that entire industry kind of, uses DigiLocker in a big way. And I would say that's been a good successful implementation, reference implementation that we cite. It's now, you have the video KYC norms that are being used by fintechs, by, NBFCs, by banks. So a lot of those, use cases also are using DigiLocker. And, but yes, in general, I would imagine that, I wish we had more usage on the commercial side, but hopefully it will pick up soon.
Yeah. So following up on that, so obviously you have the the Aadhaar eKYC framework to be able to authenticate people and so forth. So when you're saying people are using DigiLocker, is that mainly for digital document sharing between the the provider of the service, in this case, say Zerodha, or the consumer who wants to get a stock trading account? Is that what it is being used for?
So in the digital KYC norms, you will have to furnish online proof of identity and online proof of residence. So what most of these platforms are doing is that they're not actually using only DigiLocker, by the way. I'm not making that claim. But as part of their KYC workflow, they would have integrated DigiLocker, whereby you can actually use it and get your original proof of identity or proof of address, which is integrated or embedded in the online workflow. So that is what is happening.
Got it. Got it. Coming back to the OpenForge, and for that matter, are there any other ways that you recommend startups or founders leverage all this infrastructure, right? Beyond the ones that are obviously talked about, in terms of either leveraging in terms of APIs and so forth, or even contributing to it, such that they can further access. I can imagine, like, a company in logistics space or transportation, even just the examples you cited with DigiLocker should be very useful to them, right? Because they can make it lives much easier for, the transporters and the drivers and so on and so forth. But how do you recommend startups take advantage of this? Is there like a place they should go hang out, or things they should follow, or what should they do?
Yeah, I think specifically with reference to something like an OpenForge or API Setu, which is the new open API platform that is coming up, I would imagine that we are probably entering that phase or that zone where those platforms will now be opened up to the public. Right now, they are largely, their usage is confined to within the government. But so imagine something like you mentioned, startups which want to kind of contribute. So if there are specific, codecs or SDKs or any, open source, packages, software that they have built and they want to kind of put it on the platform, that is something that, we can encourage, because the whole vision behind something like OpenForge finally is that it is envisaged to be, a partnership between the government and the community. And the whole idea is that, so in a very, very much like what we see in open source across the world, is that why can't the community participate in making government platforms better? Why does the government need to spend every time they want to create a new platform? Why do they need to start from scratch? Why can't they just, reuse things that are already available in the open domain? That have been kind of either open source, or there are contributors from the community who would love to kind of be a part of it. So I think what we've logically done is that the first phase of these platforms was kind of confined and mostly focused inward within the government, that let departments within the government, a government to government, G2G, let the G2G use case be kind of explored. And the next logical step is the G2C phase, where it is that the government to community. So I would imagine that, we are very close. We are approaching that phase with respect to these platforms, where, the private sector or startups or members of this could even be individual contributors from the community. I think they will get a opportunity and a chance to kind of, participate in these platforms. And obviously, there's a whole need for upgrading these platforms, making it better. I mean, I wouldn't, while the government has come up with these platforms, I think I would not make the claim that they are the leading edge in terms of, either technology or product or design. So there's a lot of work that can come in. There's a lot of contribution that can come in from the community side to make these platforms as good as what we see on GitHub and the other popular platforms. So that opportunity, that window, I think, is just about coming up, and the community should be kind of up for it sometime soon.
Wonderful. You briefly mentioned API Setu, if I got the name right. Can you just elaborate a little bit on both how that came about and what is the kind of purpose of that?
Yeah, that's right. So this is a very exciting new development, and actually, the way it came about is that, so here's the backstory. I think in 2015, so between 2015, 16, 17, the government of India essentially kind of, has rolled out specific policies, national policies. This is the country's national policy for open source, national policy for open API, national policy for open data. So this has happened in the last 3-4 years. And so I think the open API policy was, it was rolled out, I think, in 2017 or 18. And, one of the one of the things that was attempted in that policy was that said that we should the country should try to create some kind of a platform wherein these open APIs can be showcased, and you can actually build a complete ecosystem around it, again in the private and the public space, again in where the government and the community can actually come together. So this was envisaged, but that only started happening in 2020 onwards. So when the government started looking at, okay, how do you kind of create an open API platform? And when the brainstorming was happening, when deliberations were happening, that what is the starting point for actually building this platform, one of the realizations was that if you look at what we built with DigiLocker, so DigiLocker has two parts, two logical architectural parts. So one is obviously the front end, the application, where you log in and you see all these links to your documents, which is the application part. But the backend for DigiLocker is nothing but an API gateway, right? Which is where the data exchange is happening, because the whole concept of DigiLocker works around, issuers and requesters. There are issuers of these data and these documents, and there could be requesters of or consumers of this data. And DigiLocker acts as the logical API gateway through which this exchange is happening. So while the government was looking at API Setu, but the realization came that what the API Setu needs to be, actually DigiLocker has already built the key component or the main backend for that since 2016, and that is up and running, that has been used in the platform. So what is the need to kind of, actually rebuild a new application from scratch? So what they did was something which was very imaginative, is that they've actually split DigiLocker into two logical parts. So one is the front end part, and the other part, which is the backend of DigiLocker, it's kind of, being rechristened as API Setu, which is this open API platform. And I don't think this platform has been publicly launched as yet. And some internal testing and development is going on at the moment. But the moment it gets launched, so that will give opportunity for anybody to kind of, whether you are in the private space, or I would imagine that it would start off more with, public use cases before it moves to the private use cases. But you would have an API directory where you can actually go and list your APIs on that directory, and people and other developers who want to actually use those APIs, they can actually go and look up that directory and they can actually sign up. And API Setu kind of becomes like this master gateway through which that API exchange is happening. And also it's worth pointing out, Amit, is that in the e-governance space, there are a few countries which are kind of considered the gold standards. And while they are smaller countries by far, so Estonia is a country which kind of gets talked about a lot. Singapore is another which kind of is, again, these Estonia and Singapore is considered they are considered kind of the gold standards as far as e-governance systems are concerned. Now, so Estonia actually, a lot of the good work in e-governance that Estonia has done actually happened post 1990s. And one of the things that they actually did in 2002 or 2003 onwards was they actually built a platform which is called X Roads. So you can Google it later, X Roads. And X Roads is this logical gateway which sits at the hub of the Estonian e-governance ecosystem. And it's been actually a very successful implementation. It's a reference implementation that governments across the world have studied and tried to understand. I think Estonia obviously has the advantage that it is a much smaller country, and it just got created post 1990, the country. So they don't have a lot of legacy that might bog them down. So they obviously had those advantages, but the entire world has kind of looked at what countries like Estonia and Singapore and X Roads and these platforms have done, and try to kind of ask this question: that is there a possibility, is there an opportunity for us to replicate this in our country? So what is happening with API Setu? The exciting part is that I think it's a logical step towards moving towards that X Roads paradigm. Is that where the country will have a API exchange gateway, and APIs in the public space for sure, and maybe in the private space as well. You would have some kind of a directory structure where you could actually list these APIs, and interested developers and organizations and companies can actually come and sign up for those APIs and actually use them. So I think a lot of the fragmentation, a lot of the siloed nature of what you see in government systems, you will be able to actually kind of mitigate that with something like API Setu once it comes up.
Very, very fascinating. No, I think I was just trying to remember. I think one of the Skype co-founders was an Estonian citizen, and he was talking about how progressive the country is from a digital point of view. So Amit, we're going to run out of. Sorry.
Yeah, that's correct. In fact, some of the early developers who built Skype, once they exited Skype, they actually went on to work with the government of Estonia. That's a well-recognized and a well-understood thing that happened.
I was trying to remember the name of the person, but I think it was Aati, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, so Amit, as we wrap up here at the end of the podcast, you made a very interesting career transition, right, from a corporate world to starting a company as a co-founder, successfully exiting to LinkedIn, and then now to working with the government for so many years. What is your sense of what has worked well, and what have been some of the challenges for others like you who might be inspired to contribute to the government and to make India a digital first country along the paths that we've talked about right now?
Right. I mean, to be honest, Amit, my journey was not really a very planned one. And one of the things that I've learned kind of over the years is that, one should not plan long term. You can plan, medium to short term. But just the pace of change around you is such. And who would have imagined the internet and the way it has kind of, come about and invaded our lives? So if you plan long term, sometimes, it can be restrictive. So it's better to be kind of, to plan for the short term and be open-ended, be willing to kind of, explore new unforeseen things. So that is what has happened with me, honestly, is that it's not been long-term planning. A lot of things have happened by accident. But coming to the specific question you asked, once I was exiting SlideShare, and even the government stint kind of came about in an accidental way. But I thought that it was kind of, in a way, it was a logical extension to, what I was trying to do with SlideShare, and especially sitting here in India, right? I mean, we were trying to build an innovative product for the global audiences. And once we kind of, exited that, a lot of the learnings that I had at that stage were all about, how do you build teams, how do you build products, how do you get distribution, how do you get engagement, how do you scale something to really be, to be really big. And, those questions are relevant even on the government side. It was just that, I was not thinking with the government in mind when, when those things were happening to me at SlideShare. But, what happened with India Stack and iSpirit, they kind of, gave me an opportunity and a platform. And to be honest, my first reaction when this government opportunity came my way was like, of course not. I mean, I don't want to work in the government. Who would do this? But then I kind of, took a step back and I said, you know what, this is a very unique opportunity. And for people like me, the way I would advise others is that if you really want to kind of, if you've worked in the private sector, you worked in the private space, and you should think about maybe contributing to on the public side, on the government side for a few years. You don't need to make a transition once and for all, but it can be a very very enriching. It can be a very rewarding experience if you could think this way. You could say, okay, let me take out 2 or 3 years out of my career. And, I've been working on the private side for the last 20 years. And, but what if I could devote maybe 2 or 3 years on the public side, what to the government side? Because it is definitely, it's a different cup of tea, but it is rewarding in a very different set of ways. The way I would describe it is that the rewards on the public side are actually very different from the rewards on the private side. And so I feel very thankful that, this happened to me. And my advice to others would be that, you don't necessarily need to think that I need to ditch my private career once and for all, and then make a decision that, okay, from now onwards, I'm going to work in the government side. No, I don't think that's the right way to think. The way you could think is that you think of your career in different segments. Say, okay, you know what, I've worked for the last 15, 20 years on the private side. What if I were to devote the next 2, 3, 4 years on the other side as well? Work for governments, look at the scale at which governments operate. And, in a country like India, there is opportunity all around. I mean, the good thing, I mean, not to say the good thing, but, so many things are broken in India. So the opportunity to look for solutions and build systems that actually make a real difference in the lives of citizens, that is immense. It's just, beckoning you, it's kind of inviting you in such a big way. So that's what I would, advise others who are in the, at that phase of their career and trying to make a decision about this.
Absolutely wonderful. And Amit, I think you're very kind of being very understated. I think the impact that India is having, I think we're probably the largest country, even though I'm really appreciative of the work that, say, Estonia and Singapore have done. So whenever we travel abroad and in other situations as Prime Ventures, and two of my partners also volunteered for Aadhaar for 2 years. I mean, the level, the amount of awe and envy that, right, India Stack and Digital India generates is just unfathomable. So hopefully this puts us to kind of lead in the 21st century. So thank you so much for all the contributions and the volunteering you do there. And thank you for taking the time to be on the Prime Venture Partners podcast.
Thanks a lot. I mean, this was real fun. And, so thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Dear listeners, thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast app for free, and you'll be the first one to know when new episodes are available. Just search for Prime Venture Partners Podcast in Apple Podcast, Spotify, Castbox, or however you get your podcasts. Then hit subscribe. And if you have enjoyed the show, we would be really grateful if you leave us a review on Apple Podcast. To read the full transcript, find the link in the show notes.